Good evening. So verklempt. So much happened in the last few minutes. Okay, how's everybody doing? Great to be with you and learning together on a Tuesday night. I was all set to begin, but we have a couple things happened all at once. We have an old TV that was not really working anymore. Like it worked, but it wouldn't turn on a bunch of the time. So I set it out in front of the house. Things often get taken away very quickly in this neighborhood. If there's still value to them, it's probably just a loose wire, and somebody can fix it and enjoy a pretty decent TV. And then, and when you give something away, you should be careful. You're not throwing it away. It's something that should find a new owner. So, put the power cable and the remote control in a nice bag on top of it. I listed it on the Nextdoor app. And some people were inquiring if it's still there. I'm just giving it away for free. So a few people were inquiring. And then, just as the show was about to begin, the doorbell rang. And I saw that was one of the guys from Magen Am, right? So that's the group that I'm a part of that provides security for synagogues. But also there's a lone soldier program where guys who served as lone soldiers in the IDF, in the Israeli Armed Forces. So these are American Jews, who wanted to be of service to Israel, went and served in the army. And they're called lone soldiers because they're not Israelis. They don't have family in Israel, right? So when they're over there serving and they get, like a weekend leave or something like that, like they don't have the family that they could just go to spend a few days with. Very often they're friends of family, family friends, or friends of family, and people certainly take them in, make sure they get a nice Shabbos dinner. But these are people really dedicated to the land of Israel, the people of Israel. And our group, Magen Am, started a program for lone soldiers who could work for our security company full-time. Most of us are just volunteers serving in our own synagogues. But these guys work full-time and ride in patrol vehicles in this very Jewish neighborhood where we live in. And this guy happened to be rolling by our house, saw the TV, rang our doorbell, not even knowing that there was a fellow Magen Am member living in the house. So I was so happy to see him and that he gave the new TV a good home. And we learned from Nina when she taught her Chafetz Chaim class, right, that he had this brand new pair of gloves. One of them just flew out of his hands while he was on a train. And, it just flew out of his hands off the train, and he quickly threw the other glove. Why? His student asked him, why'd you throw the second glove? He said, well, if somebody finds the first glove, what good is it going to be to them without the second glove? I want to make sure he had it. So I wanted to make sure, everybody, whoever, became the new owner of the TV would have everything they need. And then it ended up being a fellow team member. So that was great. Then when I finally got ready to start, couldn't get on the internet, started to have that panic again, but stayed cool, figured, we've like upgraded all the equipment. It should work. It needed to just be a temporary hiccup. And it was. So I apologize that I started about 8 minutes late tonight. I apologize to you. I really always try to be on time. But that's what happened. Quick Torah thought, and then we will get into it. So this week is Torah portion Noach, the story of Noah, the flood, and Noah, who was a righteous man in his generation. And our sages debate whether that means that Noah would be considered a righteous man in any generation, or just the most righteous person in, a generation that was so, filled with wickedness that God brought the flood into the world. Let's assume that he would have been a righteous man in any generation. But our writers in the table for 5 this week gave some really beautiful commentaries, and one I want to mention is Rabbi Benjamin Blech. We're very blessed to have Rabbi Blech commenting for us on the table for 5. He's a professor of Talmud at Yeshiva University and written many books, an incredible, incredible teacher. And so this commentary that'll be published tomorrow or Thursday on the verse that in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on this day, all the springs of the great deep burst apart and the windows of the heavens broke open. We forget when we think about the flood that, usually when we just think about it kind of casually, we're just like, well, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and that's what flooded the earth, right? But that's not what the Torah says. The Torah says it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, but water also came up from the deep, this flood that came from above in below. Rabbi Black says the generation of the flood sinned mightily because they desired too much. They wanted what was not legally theirs. They were people of violence who filled their lives with the quest for the possessions of others. It wasn't enough for them to have a lot. It wasn't enough for them to be rich. They had to be rich and others had to be poor. They had to have abundance and others need to have little. They epitomized Gore Vidal's maxim, "It is not enough that I succeed, others must fail." The windows of heaven opened with the divine message about the curse of too much. Water is a blessing. I wanted to mention this today because, first of all, just a few days ago, last week, we were praying at Shmini Atzeret. We said the prayer of Geshem, the prayer of rain, right? Especially in the Holy Land, one would be praying at this time that rain will come. Those winter rains, right, is what staves off drought and prepares the land for the abundance of next year. And then last night, like literally out of nowhere here in LA, we had not only rain, but we had a lightning and thunderstorm. That's very, very unusual in Los Angeles. I know in other parts of the country, lightning, thunder, you hear it all the time, but not here. And we hadn't even heard that rain was coming. So coming right on the heels of the festival and our prayers for rain, and then big rain that came last night, we were really struck by it. But it was also a reminder, coupled with Rabbi Bleck's teaching here, water is a blessing. But if you have too much water, it's a flood, right? It's too much. Anything to excess brings a flood of death and destruction. And this is the powerful flip side of what we're always blessing. When we wish each other blessings, you should be showered in blessings. I often say to my good friends, you should be showered in blessings. But anything can be too much, right? And so the Torah and our sages interpreting the Torah are always reminding us moderation, moderation, moderation. And even moderation in the subject of moderation, meaning sometimes to excess, right? Purim, Simchas Torah, those nights party to excess. But the rest of the year, no. The rest of the year, moderation. It's so important, and we're even going to see it in today's teaching on page 35 here in Tractate Beitzah. Finding that middle ground is something that it's not just about compromise. Right? Sometimes it takes a tremendous amount of cleverness and wisdom to carve out a middle ground. And sometimes a middle ground isn't the appropriate answer. But if it is, we got to, seek it and find it. Because excess of anything can really lead to trouble, even life-giving water. Okay. who is with us as we get together to do some beautiful learning on a Tuesday night. Tuesday, by the way, we just had the creation story last week. Tuesday is the day on which God says, and it was good twice. So Tuesday is considered a very good day, right? Tuesday is a very good day. Did I say that right? Which day is the day that God says it's good twice? I think it's Tuesday, but maybe it's Tuesday night going into Wednesday. I really ought to check that. Sorry, that was just a stray thought. Okay, who's with us? Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina. Stephen in New Hampshire. Brandon in Knoxville. Paula in Chicago. John in Maine. James in Indianapolis. Carolyn in Raleigh. Lucy in Minnesota. Melissa in New York. Nancy in Idaho. PK in Colorado. Stephen in Oklahoma. Belle in Texas. John in Scotland, burning the midnight oil. So glad to have you with us from Scotland. Chuck from West Virginia. Paula from the Great Northwest. Charles in Omaha. Nancy in North Carolina. Renee in Indiana. And she's in escrow. After months of shopping, a new home for us. Baruch Hashem. Renee, your home should be a place filled with light and joy and health and abundance. And we say amen. Patrice in Utah. Shahar in Tabasco, Mexico. Bienvenido, Shahar. Qué bueno que estás con nosotros. Tom in PA. Carolyn. I need to come back to that one. Are you talking about the new podcast with Danny Lobel? Awesome. I'm so glad you found that of value. I had a little problem with that video, so we're going to just hold off a couple days until we remount that video and then release it to the greater group. Jason in Connecticut. Paula loved that story. Jeff. I'm leaving this group since I never received my mezuzah. Well, Jeff, you're free to go. But in terms of the mezuzahs, we just put out the word from our partners at myzuzah.org that they're giving away mezuzahs. We don't handle the mezuzahs. We're not responsible for the mezuzahs. What can I tell you? It looks like it's time for another flood, says PK. So grateful for the table for five, says Renee. Okay, welcome everybody. And also Julie in Melville. And Charles Shapiro, my son, was a lonely soldier, and he had a family that took him as a temporary son. Beautiful. And thank him on our behalf for his service. Over here on the YouTube side, Diane in Texas, Seraphim in Sacramento, Marjorie says shalom in Georgia, right, Marjorie? And Lynn in North Texas. Welcome, everybody. Okay. Where are we holding? We are going to be finishing chapter 4 here in Tractate Beitzah. This is the 8th volume of the Talmud. We are covering page 35 today, ending chapter 4, opening chapter 5. Okay, so the last Mishna number 9 here in chapter 4, we learned that Rabbi Eliezer stated, and it was a little complicated, it was a little hard to follow, right? That a person may stand over objects which are in storage, such as produce, that he has set aside from use. And before Shabbos begins, during a sabbatical year, he can designate some of that produce for himself to use during Shabbos. So some of the concepts that were at work here is kind of the intersection of muktzeh and maaser, right? Muktzeh is objects which are prepared. Yeah. Ah, thank you. Let's light up the darkness. Too much going on. Intersection of muktzeh and maaser. Muktzeh, items which are not designated for use during Shabbos or the festival. We weren't planning to use them. They don't really have a use during this particular festival. And so we're not even permitted to touch them because they weren't prepared for use. Maaser is tithing, right? And produce, which has not yet been tithed, and let's assume we're living in the Holy Land, and when the temple is standing, when all these regulations were in effect, now we're studying them. But we understand that there was a time, and God willing, there will be a time when the temple is standing and all these regulations are in effect. And the point is that before produce is tithed, you can't eat from it. But we saw that there's an exception about casual eating, as a snack, just taking a little bit of a nibble, from your stack of produce. That's not considered a meal. If you take some of that produce and set it up as a meal, well, you can't eat untithed produce at a meal, and therefore it would not be prepared for use on the festival or even and especially not Shabbos, because you can't tithe on Shabbos or on a festival. You can't separate tithes to render the food tithed and therefore permissible for eating. You can't do the tithing process during Shabbos or a festival. Since it was untithed, it was muktzeh because it wasn't prepared for use. Maybe because even though you're not allowed to separate tithes on Shabbos or a festival by rabbinic decree, if you violated that rabbinic prohibition and separated the tithes, okay, so you would be liable to receive lashes for disregarding the words of the sages, but the food would then be tithed, and it seems like you could then eat it. Or at least somebody could eat it. Could the person who violated the sage's prohibition and did the tithing during Shabbos or the festival, could he eat it? Maybe. Seems like he might be. That's the issues that we've been discussing. So we picked this up at the top of the A side of page 35. How can one say that the very decision to partake of the fruit establishes it as fixed with regard to tithes? Meaning, Rabbi Eliezer was talking about that you have this pile of produce, which, you're a farmer or you're a merchandiser, a wholesaler, you're in the business of dealing with large amounts of fruit. So you're not thinking about eating that fruit during Shabbos. That's part of your business, not food that you're going to be eating on Shabbos. Okay, but you stood in your storeroom and said, but these fruits, I am going to eat them on Shabbos, so they are prepared for use, but they weren't tithed. Okay, that's why Rabbi Eliezer said in the Mishna, during a sabbatical year when there is no obligation to tithe. But what about during a regular year when we do have an obligation to tithe? The fact that you're planning to eat some of it, or you're planning to eat some on Shabbos, does it now kick in that you must tithe it before you have that meal? Maybe you're just planning on casually eating it, which would seem to not kick in the tithing requirement, right? That's where we're holding. But isn't it true that even if one declared his intention to eat it the following day, which would be Shabbos, that's what we're talking about in the Mishnah, it can nevertheless be assumed that... It can nevertheless be assumed that the remaining fruit is restored to the pile. And we have heard that Rabbi Eliezer explicitly said, well, anywhere where its leftovers are restored, it is not established with regard to liability for tithes at all. Now, this is why the rabbis who disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah said you can only designate some of the fruit in your storeroom for use during Shabbos if you said these fruits, from here to there, very specifically, not just generally, I'm going to take some fruit from the storeroom. Because when it was more general, there was this other idea that, well, if you just take some fruit, but whatever you don't eat, you're kicking back into the storeroom, that's much more in the nature of casual eating, and it's not going to kick in the obligation to tithe it before you can eat it. Particularly because maybe that fruit is reserved for like figs that are going to become pressed figs, or grapes that are going to become wine, or grapes that are going to become raisins. In other words, their production, their manufacture into the finished food that they're going to be hasn't finished yet. And for sure, we don't have to tithe until that food finishes becoming what it's going to be, from a wholesale point of view, as it were. Now, this is as we learned in a Mishnah in Tractate Ma'asra. One who removes olives from a vat of olives, where they are temporarily stored before being pressed, meaning you're going to make olive oil out of them. So they're being stored in a vat. While they're in that vat, You may dip them one by one in salt and eat without tithing them first, right? You're standing next to this vat of olives. I hate olives. I love olive oil. I don't like eating olives. My son loves olives. He could be sitting there eating olives all day long. If he's taking one olive at a time from olives that are standing to become olive oil, no problem. If he takes, like a bowl of olives, that he's going to take that in the house and eat those olives. Well, now he's got something more substantial going on. This is not just casual snacking from the vat. Now the tithing requirement kicks in. He should separate, 2% for the priest, 10% for the Levite, second 10% as maaser sheni. And to do that just for a bowl, it's like such a pain in the butt that he probably wouldn't take the bowl. He might sit there and eat one and one, but otherwise he'll just wait until the whole produce has been tithed properly, and then he'll start eating. So a lot of, when we're talking about eating from tithed or untithed produce, like so many things in the Torah, what we're really talking about is, don't just give in to your animal desire to have what you want when you want it. Sometimes you need to wait until things are done properly. So he may dip one by one in salt and eat without tithing them first, since he's eating them one at a time. It's like a snack. Although he's eating them even with salt, it is still not considered a fixed meal. And if he dipped and placed several olives before him, such as 10, well, then they are liable in tithes. However, Rabbi Eliezer says, one who eats from a ritually pure vat is liable to separate tithes. One who eats from a ritually impure vat is exempt. Now, why would there be this difference? Now we're talking something totally different. We've been talking about muktzeh, whether it's set aside from use on Shabbos or a festival. We've been talking about tithing, maaser. Now they're bringing in tumah, whether the thing is ritually pure or not. Like this whole vat might have been rendered tameh, ritually impure. Maybe something fell into it. Maybe it came into contact with something that came into contact with a dead body. Somehow, it's not like it's spoiled. It's not rotten. The olives didn't change at all. Not their flavor, consistency, nothing. But somehow they became ritually impure. They came into contact with a source of tumah. Why does that matter? Now it means that a priest cannot eat it. Now it means that none of that food can be taken into the precincts of the temple when the temple is standing. Now it means that, under whatever, we're not making a class about tumah right now, but in some circumstances, it can transmit that tumah sort of down the line to something else. Why does it matter whether he took olives from a vat that is tameh or tahor, ritually impure or ritually pure? Because if he himself is ritually impure, he came into contact with tumah. Okay, he might be very careful to take olives out, maybe using an instrument, so that he's not going to transmit his tumah to the vat. So he might even be able to take olives out of a ritually pure vat while he himself is impure. But having touched those olives, he's certainly not going to throw back the ones he doesn't eat. But if he's impure and the vat is impure, so then he's not going to worry about it. He's going to take some olives, and whatever he doesn't eat, he'll throw them back in the vat, right? So that's why it matters whether the vat is pure or impure, whether he is pure or impure. However, and we discussed it. We discussed this teaching. What is different in the first clause of the Mishna and what is different in the latter clause? Why is the issue of purity relevant to this case? Then Rabbi Abahu said the first case is referring to a ritually pure vat and a ritually impure person who transfers his impurity to the olives that he touches. He may not return the olives to the vat because he would render all the remaining olives ritually impure. Therefore, from the outset, he takes only the amount he wishes to eat. And this is enough to consider it a fixed meal. He took what he plans to eat. It's a fixed meal. Therefore, it needs to be tithe. However, the latter clause is referring to a ritually impure vat and a person who is ritually impure who may return the olives to the vat that he's not eating. So his manner of eating is much more casual. He's not making a meal of what he takes out of the vat. And so tithing doesn't kick in. None of these olives have been tithed since they stand to become olive oil, and the tithing the requirement to tithe won't kick in until the olive oil is finished, or a person takes a group of olives to eat as a fixed meal, or he designates some of those olives to be eaten on Shabbos. And as we've seen, Shabbos kicks in that requirement to tithe. We skip down the page a little bit. Come in here a resolution to this discussion of the Mishnah, which states, the Mishnah number 9, right? Rabbi Eliezer said that he could do this. A person may stand on Erev Shabbos, Friday afternoon, during the sabbatical year when there is no tithing requirement, and designate from the storeroom what he's going to eat on Shabbos. And the rabbis said he has to be very specific what he's saying in that storeroom is going to be eaten. Okay, from here to there. And the reason for the holding of the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer is that on Erev Shabbos, during the sabbatical year, so Friday afternoon, before Shabbos began, during a sabbatical year when there is no requirement to tithe, one can do that. But during other years of the sabbatical cycle, when we must separate tithes from our produce, it is prohibited to designate this fruit from the storeroom for use on Shabbos. And what is the reason? Is it not because Shabbos itself establishes, since he's going to eat it on Shabbos, it has to be tithed? It's going to be a fixed meal and therefore requires tithing. If this is the view of the rabbis, one may not reject it in favor of a minority opinion such as Rabbi Eliezer's. But the Gemara refutes this. No, this is not a proof. There it is different. Since he said, the person in his storeroom, from here to there I will eat tomorrow. This is the amount, this is the produce that I will eat tomorrow. He has thereby established his meal. And the reason is not because he's planning to eat it on Shabbos. It's because he's planning to eat this amount of that produce. And that's what kicks in the obligation to tithe. And the Gemara asks, if this is so, then why does Rabbi Eliezer mention particularly Shabbos, as even on a weekday as well, this would apply? If you're saying that, well, once you establish that this is the fixed meal that I'm going to eat and therefore it needs to be tithed, why are they mentioning Shabbos in our Mishnah? And the Gemara answers, this comes to teach us, as stated above, that untithed produce is not fundamentally muktzeh. It's not fundamentally set aside and impossible to use on the festival, because it is prohibited to do the tithing process during Shabbos or the festival. Rather, it is considered prepared for use on Shabbos, in that if one violated the rabbinic decree against separating tithes during Shabbos, then the food would be able to be eaten once it was tithed. You're not allowed to tithe it on Shabbos, but if you violated that decree and tithed it, okay, now the food is tithed and it can be eaten on Shabbos because it wasn't muktzeh. And we raise a contradiction from a different source in which it is taught, if one was eating from a cluster of grapes whose work is not completed, as these grapes are designated for juice extraction. These are grapes set aside for making grape juice. And he was eating this cluster of grapes it stood to become grape juice, but he took a cluster out of that pile of grapes and he's just eating the grapes themselves. And he walks into a courtyard while holding that cluster. What's the question? Now that he entered a courtyard, we've seen that when you bring produce from the field into the courtyard, that might be enough of a sort of finishing stage, even though you plan to make grape juice out of all those grapes. But you brought that cluster into the courtyard. Now it needs to be tithed before you can finish eating the cluster. Does it? That's the question. If one was eating a cluster of grapes that stood to become grape juice, and he came in from a garden where one may eat fruit in a casual manner without separating tithes, and now he enters the courtyard, so Rabbi Eliezer says he may finish eating the cluster, as the courtyard itself does not establish the fruit that now it must be tithed before it can be eaten, even if its work was not completed beforehand. It didn't become grape juice yet. But Rabbi Yehoshua says he may not finish the cluster. The fact that he brought it into a courtyard establishes that cluster of grapes as a meal, and it needs to be tithed before you can finish eating it. And similarly, if it grew dark on a Friday evening, the night of Shabbat, while one was eating that cluster of grapes, And any kind of eating on Shabbos is considered like a fixed meal. So Rabbi Eliezer says, he may finish that cluster, as not even Shabbos establishes the fruit as a fixed meal because its work was not completed. Those grapes stood to become grape juice. The fact that he was eating this cluster and it became Shabbos doesn't mean that now it needs to be tied. But Rabbi Yehoshua says he may not finish that cluster of grapes, even though its work was not completed, it hasn't become grape juice yet. The fact that he was eating that cluster and now something that he's eating, it becomes Shabbos. Whatever you're eating on Shabbos has to come from tithed food, right? Anything that you eat on Shabbos has to come from tithed food, according to Rabbi Yehoshua. So the Gemara answers, so this indicates that Rabbi Eliezer maintains that Shabbos does not establish food with regard to tithes, whereas our Mishnah indicates that he agrees that the beginning of Shabbos does establish them as fixed. So we brought that whole example to show that, well, Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah about completing your eating of a cluster of grapes seems to contradict Rabbi Eliezer's position in our Mishnah about that you can designate from the storeroom to be eaten on Shabbos, even though it's untied. But does it say that? Because there's no tithing in the sabbatical year, which is the example of our Mishnah. So the Gemara answers, the reason is, as he taught explicitly that Rabbi Nassan says, it is not that when Rabbi Eliezer said he may finish, he meant that he may finish in the courtyard itself, but rather he meant he may exit the courtyard and finish. And similarly, is not that when Rabbi Eliezer said he may finish, he meant that he may finish on Shabbos itself, but rather he meant that he may wait until Shabbos is over and then he can finish eating that cluster of grapes. We skip a bit, and now we're near the top of the B side of page 35. With regard to the statement that a transaction does not fix fruit for tithes. Okay, so we've been talking about if you designated the fruit to eat it on Shabbos, does it mean that you'd have to tithe it now? We've been talking about that you were eating it and you brought it into a courtyard. Does it need to be tithed now? Or you were going to eat it on Shabbos. Does it need to be, it became Shabbos. Does it need to be tithed now? Now we're looking at a different event, a different kind of incident that might take produce, which was in the process of becoming something finished, like olives that were going to become olive oil or grapes that were going to become grape juice, right? And before it became olive oil or before it became grape juice, you exchange some of the fruit in your pile with some other kinds of fruit that your friend has. You know, my neighbor grows pomegranates, I grow grapes. He's going to make pomegranate juice, I'm going to make grape juice. But before the juice is finished and the tithing requirement kicks in, I take some of my grapes from my grape pile and I trade with my friend for some of his pomegranates. Now, the fact that we just basically made a commercial transaction of grapes for pomegranates, can we do that with untithed produce? That's the question we're asking now. So with regard to the statement that a transaction does not fix fruit and make it that you must tithe it, this is as we learned in a Beitzah. In the case of one who acquired figs from an Am Haaretz, an Am Haaretz is a nation of the land. In this case, it means an ignoramus Jew, right? An Am Haaretz, the sages are talking about a Jew who doesn't know the laws of tithing or other halachas, other Torah-based laws of Jewish observance. So it's a Jew who's just not educated in the law. If you're buying produce from him, it's a problem because you're not sure if he tithed it or not, right? That's why the status of being an Am Haaretz was relevant to Torah law in the Talmud. So in the case of one who acquires figs from an Am Haaretz in a place where most people press figs, where most people press and dry their figs in order to make them into cakes, right? So we're in a locale where most of the figs that are grown are not eaten as fresh figs, but rather they get pressed into cakes of dried figs. And now I acquired some figs from an Am Haaretz. So the work of the figs is not completed at this stage. And I may therefore, the buyer who acquired from the Am Haaretz, may therefore partake of them in a casual manner. And when their work is completed, he need only tithe them as doubtfully tithed produce. So 2 different cases. I acquire figs from an Am Haaretz in a locale where the figs are normally turned into cakes of dried figs. So in one case, I get the figs from him while they're still like fresh from the pile of figs. And in the second case, I get some dried fig cakes. Their production is finished. So for sure, it's going to be like casual eating, not a fixed meal when they're just figs from the pile. But what about when they're dried figs? Now, when you acquire dried figs from a chaver, right, meaning an educated Jew, so you would expect that he wouldn't sell you untithed produce. You can assume that the tithes have already been removed from that produce and it's ready to eat. But if you buy a cake of dried figs from an Am Haaretz, you can't be sure that he separated tithes from them. So now it's doubtfully tithed produce. And so now what are you going to do about that? And the law is, so we have to tithe them, but we follow the laws of tithing doubtfully tithed produce as opposed to the law of untithed produce, right? It's not like you just receive definitely untithed produce and you definitely have to separate the tithes. The rules with what you do about doubtfully tithed produce are a little different. And the Gemara comments, one can learn from this Beitzah 3 laws. Learn from here that a transaction establishes produce as fixed. That's right. The fact that you made a transaction means that the tithing must be done, but that only happens with regard to an item whose work is completed. So if you sell or exchange, grapes from the grape pile that's going to later become grape juice, or olives from the olive pile that's later going to become olive oil, the fact that you make an exchange or even a sale doesn't mean that they need to be tithed right now. They don't, right? It can still be casual eating as long as you don't make a fixed meal out of it. And one can learn a second law, that most people in the category of an Am Haaretz do separate tithes, right? It's not that they definitely don't because they're ignorant. It's just that we can't be sure that they did. But most of them do. And so this is considered doubtfully tithed produce, not surely untithed produce, right? Doubtfully tithed produce, and that's called demai. So the produce that you buy from an Am Haaretz, even if it's finished state, the production is finished, it's going to be considered demai, doubtfully tithed, not certainly untithed. And the third lesson we can learn from this is that one may tithe demai, doubtfully tithed produce, purchased from an Am Haaretz, even with regard to something whose work is not completed. So you can tithe demai even if its work is not completed. And Rabbi Yochanan rules in accordance with this opinion to exclude that which we learned in the Mishna, one who exchanges fruits with his friend, that was the case we started with, which is considered a commercial transaction if their intention was for this one to eat and that one to eat, or for this one to make them into dried fruit and for that one to make them into dried fruit. They are both obligated in tithes. Rabbi Yehuda, however, says the one who took fruits in order to eat is obligated. Hold on a second. The one who took the fruits in order to eat them, he's obligated. As for him, their labor is completed. He's eating them. But the one who intended to make them into dried fruit is exempt and may partake of the fruit in a casual manner. As for him, their work has not been completed. Right? So I grow grapes. My neighbor grows pomegranates. He says to me, hey, give me some grapes. I'll give you some pomegranates. I'm like, yeah, I want to eat some pomegranates right now. He gives me some pomegranates. I'm planning to eat them right now. He's going to take my grapes and turn them into raisins. I have to tithe the pomegranates before I can eat them, because even though he was planning on making pomegranate juice, I'm now eating pomegranates. So to me, they're finished. And if I'm going to make a meal out of them, for sure, I need to tithe them. He's taking the grapes to make raisins out of them. Their work is definitely not finished, so he doesn't have to tithe them yet. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 9 in chapter 4, and it concludes chapter 4. We now open the final chapter of Tractate Beitzah, and this 5th chapter is about decrees of the sages with regard to festivals that are not so much about protecting us from coming to violate Torah laws, as much as it is preserving the character of the festival, preserving the sanctity of the festival. There are certain kinds of work that wouldn't violate Shabbos. So, it's not technically a violation of the categories of labor that are prohibited on Shabbos and on festivals, based on the categories of constructive labor required to make the tabernacle in the desert. And nevertheless, they say don't do it because it feels too much like strenuous labor that shouldn't be done on the festival or on Shabbos, right? It's not Shabbosistic. It's not Chagistic, right? Chag being the word for festivals, or Yomtov. It's not Yomtov-istic. The Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 5. I'm going to read the Mishnah and then just a little bit of the commentary, so I'm almost done. Get your questions and comments in. Mishnah number 1 of chapter 5. One may lower produce which had been laid out on a roof to dry, into the house through a skylight on a festival in order to prevent it from becoming ruined in the rain. Although it is a strenuous activity, it is permitted to do so on a festival in order to prevent a financial loss. However, one may not do so on Shabbos, and one may cover produce inside a building with cloths to prevent damage due to a leak in the ceiling over it. And similarly, one may cover jugs of wine and jugs of oil for the same reason. And one may place a vessel beneath a leak in order to catch the water on Shabbos to prevent it from dirtying the house. Why through a skylight, right? So first of all, most houses had flat roofs in Talmudic times. This is where the Torah is actually referring to that you need to put a parapet on the roof, that there needs to be a guardrail lest people go up on your roof and fall off your roof and hurt themselves. You can lower this produce because, you've got produce up there. This is part of your livelihood. You're expecting it to dry out and become raisins. This is the dry season. There's no reason to think it's going to rain. And suddenly it starts raining like it did yesterday in LA. And it could ruin all that produce. It could be very difficult for you to enjoy the festival under those conditions. Now on Shabbos, too bad. You're not going to be able to deal with it. It's just too un-Shabbosistic to lower that produce into the house to protect it from loss. But on a festival where you're already handling food because food preparation is allowed and you're moving some food around because food preparation is allowed, they're going to let you lower it through the skylight, but not by putting a ladder up against the roof because that's too much like the work week. Just like we could cut some wood with a butcher's cleaver to make a fire for cooking on a festival, but we can't use an axeman, like a wood chopper's axe on the festival to chop wood, even though it's for the fire that is going to be a cooking fire. So you can lower it through the skylight, is what the Mishnah says. The Gemara discusses the law in our Mishnah. And we learn that one may lower produce through a skylight on a festival. So the Gemara asks, well, up to how much produce may be lowered in this manner? I mean, if you've got, 100 sacks of produce up on that roof, lowering them through the skylight to protect them from the rain into your home where you're celebrating the festival, that's not going to work. That's definitely not going to be in keeping with the rejoicing nature of this festival that we're trying to preserve. So, 100 sacks, no way. 1 sack, no big deal. So what's going to be the number of what's permissible, and beyond that, it's not permitted? So up to how much produce may be lowered? Rabbi Zera said that Rav Asi said, and some say that Rav Asi said that in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. It is like that which we learned in a Mishnah with regard to a different case. One may clear out 4 or 5 sacks of hay or grain from a room on Shabbos due to visitors, right? So you're going to do the mitzvah of providing hospitality to guests. Unexpected people are going to come and stay with you on Shabbos. They arrived on Shabbos. You want to give them a place to sleep. So you're going to clear out some space in a place where you were storing some grain so that they have a comfortable place to sleep. Okay, so we can move 4 or 5 sacks. Again, we can't move 100 sacks of grain for this purpose, but we could move 4 or 5. So, says Rabbi Yochanan, this seems to be a good measure for what we're allowed to bring down from the roof on a festival. Or you can do that to do hospitality to guests on Shabbos, or due to suspension of study in the study hall, i.e. to make room there for more people who would not be able to study Torah otherwise, right? There's like you're actually getting a little Torah lecture in a space where there's some sacks stored, and more people want to come in here the Torah lecture. So for the purpose of the mitzvah of Torah study, which is one of the highest mitzvahs of all, you're going to allow them to clear out some space, but again, not an unlimited number of sacks, 4 or 5. So the Gemara raises an objection to the comparison of these two cases, but perhaps there it is different, since there is the matter of the mitzvah, of making sure that there's enough room in the study hall for more people to be learning Torah, or to make room for the hospitality to guests on Shabbos. But here, where there's no mitzvah involved, you're just saving sacks from financial loss, maybe we shouldn't allow that. Alternatively, or maybe it's a different type of false reasoning. There is the reasoning that 4 or 5 sacks are permitted because Shabbat is very severe in people's eyes and they will not come to belittle it. But festivals where already the rules are more lax than on Shabbos, now that you allow them to move 4 or 5 sacks, maybe they're gonna, on Shabbos, you only let them move 4 or 5 sacks, and you know that they're not going to move anymore. They will not come to belittle Shabbos from the fact that you allow them to move 4 or 5 sacks. But on a festival, which is regarded more lightly, and which people might come to belittle, maybe people shouldn't, Shabbos is already considered very sacred in people's eyes. So if you allow them to move 4 or 5 sacks, they're only going to move 4 or 5 sacks. But the festival where already the rules are more lax, and people, are just more likely to take advantage of these leniencies. If you say you can move 4 or 5 sacks, they're going to come and move 10 or 20. So because of that, we shouldn't allow them to move any sacks at all. Alternatively, we could go from another perspective and say, because there is no monetary loss involved on Shabbos, right, then you can move 4 or 5 sacks. But now on the festival where there is monetary loss involved, and that's people are going to really stress about that, maybe since the rules are already a little bit lax, we should allow them to move 10 or 20 sacks. And that's where we're going to leave it, a bit of a cliffhanger. We're going to continue that discussion tomorrow. Which way are they going to go? Are they going to allow the 4 or 5 sacks on the festival, like Shabbos, in terms of clearing space for the study hall? But now the reasoning is different. Are they going to allow no sacks, more sacks? We'll learn tomorrow. Okay, questions or comments? On page 35. Caroline, I thought we previously learned that an ignoramus is defined as one who willfully chooses to stay ignorant. Maybe. I confess that I don't remember if that was the definition that we fell on, that we found it somewhere. I don't remember. So I'm not saying that's right. I'm not saying that's wrong. I just don't remember. But the point is, right, that in terms of the halachic category of the Am Haaretz, and what we learned today is they're people that we can't be sure that they tithed properly, right? Or we can't be sure that they refrain from contracting ritual impurity. It's a category. It's not about looking down on people who don't have a good Torah education, because in fact, this category is not relevant today at all, except within Talmud study, right? This was a category that mattered in the ancient world when the laws of ritual purity and the laws of tithing were in force. Now those laws, for the most part, we just study them. There is tithing of produce, but it's not that 22% like it used to be. It's sort of a very nominal amount on produce from Israel. I mean, it's a whole bunch of other complicated laws. But in terms of defining what an Am Haaretz is, the importance of it is that it was a category with respect to these laws when tithing and tumah and entering the temple were all in force. And since the temple was destroyed, it really only matters within the world of studying the laws from 2,000 years ago. This is not something that we bandy about as a label to apply to people who aren't in our class today and who aren't learning with us. If we were going to apply the label, I'd be an Am Haaretz. I've been through the whole Talmud once. I'm teaching at this time, but there's so many people so much more learned than I. This is not about passing a judgment. It's just a category in terms of how we handle demai, as an example. When we buy produce from an Am Haaretz, how are we going to treat it? That's the importance of the label. But still, when eating in a casual manner, you still make a blessing. Absolutely. Absolutely, right? The fact that you're eating in a casual manner just excuses you from eating otherwise untithed. It allows you to eat untithed produce. But anytime we eat something in this world, we need to make a bracha, right? We need to make a blessing. And we learned elsewhere that eating any food without saying a blessing, in other words, without thanking God for the food that came to you, is actually considered like stealing, right? Like God gave us to eat in this world, like all the food. We just went through the creation story, right? And like all the food in the world is given to us to eat. We can eat it. Obviously there's a whole, the people who grow it get paid for growing it. The people who transport it get paid for transporting it. We pay for food. But the fact that food is there and it reaches our plate and we have the ability to sustain ourselves by eating it is a blessing from God, and we need to thank God for it. And that's why we would never eat without making a blessing. And finally, Tom, how do you get to the roof without a ladder? So I think we're distinguishing between the inside ladder and the outside ladder, right? The permanent ladder to get up to the roof versus a ladder that you would put up there in order, to move stuff in the commercial manner of the weekday. But we haven't finished that discussion yet, and I didn't read ahead till tomorrow's page. So let's see, because this discussion is going to continue tomorrow about this Mishna about lowering produce through the skylight. Because it didn't say one may lower produce from the roof into the house to prevent financial loss on a festival. The Mishnah specified the skylight. So I'm guessing that they're saying through the skylight because that's not the weekday manner. During the weekday, you'd have a much more commercial type of process where you can move a lot of the produce at a time. Through the skylight is much more of a MacGyvered method of bringing a bit of that produce, within a certain amount, that permissible amount, down into the house. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 36 of Tractate Beitzah. Have a wonderful evening.